Thank you very much. Say again? This isn't like a normal place where the spotlight follows me. Because frankly, the spotlight follows me anyway, whether the light's on me or not. Anyway, thank you, Professor Erickson. His ISO group work is essentially just starting, although we had done some work on it before. It needs to be redone a little bit. But what I'm going to talk about today is not old stuff, but a new standard, not a draft standard, a standard that is now being promulgated by ISO and is important for high-speed craft. And it's important because of various issues that we probably all know about. Repeated shocks, not vibration. Repeated shocks are the problem with high-speed craft. Everybody knows this is the thing. And we continue describing it as if it is a vibration. So vibration's a problem, but it's not our particular problem. It's suspected to contribute to lumbar spinal injuries, in part suspected because, for instance, definitive epidemiology hasn't been done. Most of the epidemiology done on our side in the US has been anecdotal, based on questionnaires, which is fine, but there are still people going, well, you know, these guys ride four-wheelers out on weekends, so maybe it's the four-wheelers, not the high-speed craft, causing these problems. I will say that when we finally got the first epidemiology, the injury rate among this population was 4 times higher than any other MOS in the US military. So pretty bad occupational health problem, and things like Johan is doing in epidemiology are essential now to helping us move forward. I will disagree with something he says later, but now I'm agreeing with him. So the guidelines that are intended to limit exposure, for instance, the EU directive, are often nonsense for high-speed craft, and I'll show you some nonsense. So some of you saw this yesterday, and you've probably seen it before. And so we did this, and it was a test of a shock-isolated seat. So you hear 2 people. The guy grunting is the guy in this seat. We have video on the other guy too, but the guy grunting is the one you can, well, and he's not grunting anymore.
Everybody okay? Is everybody okay?
So we were testing one thing. We were testing an isolated seat. There were 14 other people in the boat on the standard seats. I say non-isolated because they aren't rigid seats. These seats are made of aluminum, and they bend fairly well under 12 Gs. They bend enough that I consider them sort of passively, inadvertently isolated seats. And as you get older on these seats, and I have a couple of them, as you get older on these seats, they get a little more bendy, and they get a little better for shock isolation. But we're not testing this guy. We just happen to have a video on him. This guy's in a non-isolated seat. Okay, so sea state 1. This is mostly flat water, and we reached an area where there were essentially 2 rogue waves, and these rogue waves are quite likely wakes. This is off the coast of California near Coronado. So you can see the lights of San Diego. Do I have a pointy thing? Yeah, whatever. I'll use my own pointy thing. Oh, thank you. You know, at this age, I can't see this, right? So I need... These are the lights of San Diego. He's sitting here, sea state 1. Okay. So let's consider what the EU directive for RMS would say about our situation here, because we measured the seat, we measured the deck, we measured the deck in various places, we measured a whole bunch of things, and the ISO directive says, okay, we'll keep it below 1.15 meters per second squared for an 8-hour day. That's great. Okay, our measurements say that the RMS acceleration is 0.2. So it's below 1.15 meters per second squared. So we're good, right? Everything is perfectly okay. We're good. Are we good? Do you think we're good? Well, no, just based on what you hear on the video, do you think we're good? He's not good. He actually remained in the, this is a long time ago, he remained in the group for a long, long time and finished his career. I will tell you, he is broken. And so we're not good. And that makes sense because we know we're not good. He just complained bitterly about this, and he's not especially a complaining guy. So RMS hides the impact. It can't hide a whole bunch of other things, and you can't see him in the video, but his fucking back hurt. That's one. Everybody else's fucking back in the front row hurt, except for the guy who was in the isolated seat. Even though it was bottoming out, it was a soft bottoming seat, so the bottoming behavior was something to be avoided, but it wasn't something that was a tremendously exacerbating event. And there was an acute disc herniation in an engineer in the third row, so he's actually closer to the LCG, far closer than this guy. So this is a problem, and the EU calculation is nonsense. So the EU calculation for VDV also has very similar problems, because the exponent on the VDV calculation is not sufficient to represent the badness of the high impacts. And so we had an idea, and we didn't consider it a particularly novel idea, and I'll show you that that was in 2007, so this is a long time ago. Sometimes the ISO process takes a while. So what we wanted to know is how many little impacts, and I use Johann's metaphor. So this is a super flyweight, and you can see they hit each other a lot. An awful lot. In fact, the guy in red has got the guy in blue's number and has hit him like 6 times in the face with almost no defense. Right after this, the ref stops it. There's a technical knockout. So he's knocked out. And then how many little impacts equal one big impact? If boxing was bad, this is worse. So, yeah. So we know this. We know in head injury, we know in spinal injury that 2 times impact, accelerative loading that's twice the accelerative loading is not twice as bad. Badness is multiplied as you increase, and it's not a linear factor. But what we care about is for the spine. So I know something about, I think she's okay, she's smiling. But the dose matters. And so we started simply. We can't start with the whole problem. The whole problem is incredibly complicated with lateral, torsional, all sorts of flexion compression. And we started simply with compression only, in part because there was an existing ISO standard that addressed compression, but it only addressed compression to 4 Gs. Well, now that's not okay for high-speed craft. And it only, it had limitations in its representation of how humans responded. Humans responded in that ISO standard by some magic black box that I personally didn't understand. And so I was pretty sure that nobody understood it, and I found out that that was essentially true. And so we replaced it with something that was more easily understandable. So we assumed a ramp profile similar to what we measured in high-speed craft. It's difficult to solve the whole problem, and please ignore what Johann said yesterday. This is all lab work. It's actually useful to do lab work sometimes, even though I asked the question that Johann fed me. So lab work and field work often go together because I can't explicitly injure somebody on the sea, but I can explicitly injure my cadavers. So we did a whole bunch of tests on spines. I'm not going to talk about them in detail, but a whole bunch of tests on cadaver spines. And so you think, well, they're all 70-year-olds. Well, they weren't all 70-year-olds. There were some 30-year-olds. There were some 40-year-olds. There were a couple of 70-year-olds. But by and large, these were youngish people, and youngish people that would be applicable to the population that we're talking about. So both males and females in the United States, there is no MOS that isn't open to women now. And to prepare for this new future, we started thinking about this. So this is a fairly large study for cadaveric studies, and Interestingly enough, the whole analysis, the whole thing that we did to assess spinal fracture is based on ship things. So Liberty ships in World War II, some of them cracked in half like this. That's bad. Surely y'all all knew this. Bad is cracked in half, and this Palmgren minor fatigue theory was developed in part to determine what the hell it takes to crack something in half like this. So the nice thing is we could do this, and unlike well, Johan may have suggested we not use equations, but I'm not going to talk about the equation. We develop an equation, and the equation is for risk for male and female injuries based on repeated loading, applicable to high-speed craft, in terms of this R value. So this R value is important because we didn't want to have a whole bunch of coefficients that people didn't exactly know how they work together and a complicated model. We have a relatively simple model, and I'll explain what the simple model is. It depends on the severity of each impact. Well, that makes sense. Your response, your brokenness depends on the severity of each impact that you get. So that makes sense. It depends, and so this severity is also scaled by how big you are and how big your spine is. So males have a response, females have a response, and they're just basically scaled by size, and that worked out really well. The number of impacts at each impact level. So that makes sense because you'd think that if you had two of them, may not be twice as bad as having one, but it certainly has something to do with making it worse. The exponent is important here. VDV's exponent is 4. The exponent here is 6. What this means is that the higher level impacts are much worse than the lower level impacts. So if you have an impact of 2 Gs and then you have another impact of 4 Gs, conforming with experience, the 4G impact is not twice as bad as the 2G impact. The 8G impact is not twice as bad as the 4G impact. It turns out they're 64 times worse as you increase by a factor of 2. And by the time you get to 12 Gs, that's a pretty severe impact. By the time you get to 24 Gs, filtered at 80 hertz, I'm pretty sure none of us can sit there and take that. So 24 Gs is a pretty bad number, and given here by the coefficient age is age. Age makes sense because age, as you age, your spine changes in properties, it becomes less strong, and then that affects your ability to withstand. So, as I mentioned, the 1/6 matters, and I want to emphasize this because this is one of the big differences between here and VDV. VDV's exponent is not high enough to emphasize really big things. And it's important in the design of seats, so VDV will drive you to very soft seats, and it won't penalize you for getting really bad bottoming behavior. The worst thing you can do with a seat is to take a 10G impact, bottom, and make that a very, very injurious impact. Bottoming behavior in high-speed craft is to be avoided, as I'm sure you all know, but I have difficulty sometimes preaching to the different choir. So, and it also conforms with experience that in this formulation, at 1G, even a lifetime isn't enough to get a high risk value for impacts. And this conforms with experience too. We all walk around at 1G. We have 1G impacts all the time as we walk, and we don't get injured from this typically. Typically we get injured because we get overweight and we bend over a lot, and we do a whole bunch of things that may not be quite good for us. Another interesting thing in the context of men versus women is that we were a little surprised when we found that women's spines are weaker, and they're weaker on a stress basis. So we have accounted for all of the things, and women's spines are still weaker. And so this probably is bone quality. We don't exactly know why this is. Women's bone quality decreases earlier, doesn't decrease this early. But interestingly enough, as you go up to older and older, and we don't have 80-year-old people, but we may have 80-year-old people riding the boats, as you go up to 80, men and women get closer, but they never really get to be the same thing. So this is important when we're starting to load women up with equipment that we haven't scaled for their masses, and I'll talk about this in just a second. So if we look at predicted risk values, lifetime risk values for male versus female, this is the EU directive. The lifetime risk under these values for the limit value is something well under 1%. So that assumes a bunch of things about the RMS that may or may not be true, and in fact, that's a high limit. The limit could be far lower than that depending on what happened with the RMS as opposed to these peak values, which I showed you doesn't work that well. If you look at things like dump trucks, I mean, these are heavy vibration vehicles, forklift trucks, locomotives. There was an awful lot of work on locomotives, but locomotives have almost no risk of this. If you look at the U.S. Navy Mark V, this is a high-speed craft that we no longer use. The lifetime risk of this is about 40%. And this conforms with experience with people who had been in the units for a length of time, up to 20 years, and very many of them are broken now. So broken meaning that they have spinal injuries, long-term chronic spinal injuries, and we want to avoid this. Interestingly enough, well, it'd be interesting if I hadn't changed the slide. Interestingly enough, all the women are lower than men. Didn't I tell you that women are weaker than men? Women's torsos are also smaller than men's, so it's compensating. This is great for women as long as they're sitting there without equipment on them. Typically, body armor isn't scaled for mass, so women have to wear the same body armor as a man does with the same overall mass, which hurts her. Women have to wear the same helmets as men with the same body mass, which hurts them. So anything that isn't scaled specifically for women can be a problem, and we're discussing this with the military right now. So we really need to treat them as two separate, men and women as two separate populations. I think we probably already do anyway. So the implications, this can be used in design and assessment tools to mitigate risk. Being a high-speed craft operator for 20 years may be risky for your lumbar spine. I think everybody already knew that. The important thing about men versus women is we must take care, as I said, in burdening women with equipment that aren't scaled for their torsos. So to a certain extent, we can't do this. So for night vision equipment, we can't scale it based on their torso mass. We have to scale it based on the physics of the thing that we're trying to do. So we have to be cognizant of, say, neck injuries in women because of this. We also have to be cognizant of neck injuries in smaller people because of this. It's another issue. I was talking to the people in the U.S. many years ago who do night vision, and their goal was to get the whole system with counterbalance down to 6 kilos. Right. And I said, 6 kilos is an awful lot since a 50th percentile male's head weighs 5 kilos, so you're putting more than the amount of mass on their head again. And any time in biomechanics the story starts with, well, the women in Africa, anytime it starts like that, the end of it can't be good. So the women in Africa carry 70 kilos on their heads and a moose too or something else. But again, more than the mass of the head on the head is a bad thing, no matter how many women in Africa can carry that. All right, so in summary, we have a new standard, ISO 2631 Part 5. It's been accepted after 10 years of discussions. So the arguments that we had were mostly irrelevant to high-speed craft. These were about locomotives largely. And as I mentioned, locomotives don't have the problems we have. I was stunned to find out that locomotive drivers in Germany are men. There appear to be no women who are driving these locomotives in Germany, which seems like it's an incredibly good career. So I would recommend, if there are any women in the audience who are Germans, fight for your right to drive those damn locomotives. The methodology has been accepted for Mill Standard 1472 in the US, and there is a strong need for health surveillance, epidemiology, to assess this. We have some epidemiology, but it's fairly limited, to assess this and to develop better tools. Additional research is absolutely necessary in off vertical loading, so side loading, torsional loading, and the head and neck. So if we are going to do military operations with head-supported masks, with helmets, with night vision, with other things that might be on your head, it's absolutely essential because the neck is the next big problem here for military operators. But also important to recognize that there's things we can do in the laboratory that we can't that we can't do in the field. There are things that we can do in the field that we can't do in the laboratory, and those things must work together. Thank you.